On July 14, 1941, 3 weeks after the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the German war machine, the Wehrmacht, seemed unstoppable. It was advancing at a speed that defied military logic. Its tank groups, acting like armored scythes, were biting 500 kilometers deep into Soviet territory. The Red Army, caught off guard by Stalin's self-deception that Hitler would not attack, found itself in a state of catastrophic collapse. Army Group Center, the armored fist of the invasion, had shattered Soviet defenses in the Białystok-Minsk pocket, capturing more than 300,000 men. The city of Smolensk, a historic gateway to Moscow, was encircled. To the west of this doomed city, the vital railway junction of Orsha had fallen. Orsha was a critical artery for the Wehrmacht's final push. Into this small town, the German logistical chain pumped the blood of the offensive. Train after train, packed with troops, ammunition, fuel, and artillery, gathered for what seemed like one last simple 200-kilometer leap toward the Soviet capital. To the soldiers of the 17th Panzer Division securing the Orsha railway area, the war seemed nearly won. The Red Army was not merely retreating, it was shattered, fleeing, decapitated. The Soviet Union, that enormous mysterious colossus of Bolshevism, appeared to be exactly what Hitler had claimed, a rotten structure standing on clay legs, ready to collapse from a single strong blow. The mood was triumphant, almost carelessly arrogant. At 15:15 Moscow time, something new occurred. It did not begin with the familiar distant thud of artillery or the high drone of a bomber. It began with a sound. A low, deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from the forests to the east. A sound out of place on a battlefield, a vibration felt more with the teeth and chest than with the ears. Then the rumble transformed. It swelled into a deafening, terrifying, animalistic roar, a piercing, unearthly wail that seemed to come from everywhere. A sound like a giant tearing a canvas sheet the size of the sky. From wooded terrain 8 kilometers away, German sentries saw it. Not one flash, but 7 simultaneous blinding flashes. Seconds later the sky above Orsha's railway station split apart with dozens of rocket trails, glowing like incandescent comets. In less than 10 seconds, more than 132 mm high explosive fragmentation rockets annihilated the Orsha station. The destruction was absolute. This was not the surgical, predictable damage of artillery shells, this was annihilation. The entire target area, spanning several city blocks, was simultaneously saturated with explosives and burning fuel. 3 entire ammunition trains, dozens of fuel tankers, and hundreds of German support soldiers and engineers were destroyed. Secondary explosions from ammunition depots shook the city for hours, a funeral pyre for German confidence. The psychological shock outweighed even the physical destruction. The Germans had faced artillery before. They had faced bombers. But this was something else. It was the fire of an enraged primitive god. German intelligence reports, stamped Geheim, secret, revealed pure confusion. New unknown weapon, one trembling report stated. Fires in salvos. Effect horrifying. There were accounts describing burning cannonballs in the sky. This was not artillery. This was something new. The Germans, masters of technological warfare, soon gave the weapon a name, born of raw animal terror, inspired by the unholy howling sound of the rockets and the many launcher rails resembling the pipes of a church organ. They called it the Stalin Orgel, Stalin's organ. But the Soviet soldiers who operated it, who saw in it their burning angel of vengeance, gave it a gentler, more affectionate name, taken from a popular romantic folk song. They called it Katyusha. The weapon that stunned the Wehrmacht at Orsha was not a sudden panic invention. It was the product of a decade of secret, brilliant and ultimately tragic work conducted under the shadow of Stalin's deadly paranoia. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union was obsessed with new military technologies, driven by a crippling inferiority complex and a genuine fear of foreign invasion. The intellectual force behind this movement was Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, brilliant, ruthless, and visionary. Tukhachevsky foresaw what he called deep battle, a concept of rapid mechanized warfare that was, in truth, the grandfather of the German blitzkrieg. He needed a new weapon for this new war, not just better tanks and aircraft, but rockets. At the heart of this research was the Gas Dynamics Laboratory, GDL, in Leningrad, and later the merged Reactive Scientific Research Institute, RNI, in Moscow. The minds were several visionaries, men like Vladimir Artemyev, Ivan Klemyanov, and most importantly Georgy Langmak. Langmak was a genius. By the mid-1930s his RNI team had solved the hardest problem in rocketry, stable solid fuel. While German and American engineers were focused on complex volatile liquid fuels, the future of spaceflight, Langmak's team perfected a method of extruding smokeless nitrocellulose powder into reliable, storable solid fuel charges. This was the key. These rockets could be produced, stored for years, and still fire reliably every time. By 1937 his team had perfected the RS-82 and RS-132 rockets, 82 mm and 132 mm projectiles. RS meant reactive projectile. The first use was in the air. Soviet I-16 fighters were equipped with these simple rail-launched rockets and first saw serious combat against the Japanese at Kokkin Gol in 1939. It was a stunning success. Soviet pilots like Captain N. Zvonaryov became aces using these fiery arrows to shoot down Japanese aircraft from distances beyond the effective range of machine guns. But the visionaries at RNI wanted more. They imagined launching these rockets from the ground, and not one at a time, but in massive, terrifying salvos. The first prototypes were built, crude constructions on towed trailers. But just as their work began to bear fruit, the curtain of Stalin's Great Terror fell. Marshal Tukhachevsky, father of deep battle, was arrested and executed in 1937. His protégé rocket scientists were next. This is one of the greatest tragedies in Soviet history. In 1938, on blatantly fabricated charges of sabotage and treason, Ivan Klemyanov and Georgy Langmak were arrested by the NKVD. They were tortured in the Lubyanka basements. They were executed with a shot to the back of the head. The men who created the Katyusha were killed by their own state just months before their weapon would be desperately needed for its survival. The project passed to others, particularly Andrei Kostakov, who, according to many historians, sealed the fate of his colleagues by falsely denouncing them to steal their work and claim credit for himself. But the research itself was deemed too important to stop, even if its creators were dead. The problem was no longer the rocket, but the launcher. How to mount dozens of rockets onto a vehicle that could move, fire, and, above all, escape. Reloading time was the rocket's Achilles heel. After firing, the launcher became an easy target. Mobility was its only protection. Early clumsy prototypes were tested. Each launcher was equipped with 50-kilogram demolition charges. If capture was inevitable, the crews were to destroy the trucks, the rockets, and themselves. This was a state secret on the level of the future atomic bomb. In mid-July, as Army Group Center prepared to storm Smolensk, Captain Flerov found his target, the overcrowded Orsha railway hub. He positioned his 7 launchers in a forest glade, aimed using simple artillery sights, and gave the order to fire. 7 launchers vomited fire, sending 112 rockets into the sky in a perfect, horrifying wave. The era of rocket artillery had begun. To the Germans, the strike on Orsha was an incomprehensible, terrifying mystery. Their intelligence officers feverishly searched for answers, sketching multi-barreled guns and new types of aerial bombs. They were completely overwhelmed. Their own rocket program, led by the brilliant Wernher von Braun, was focused on large, complex liquid fuel strategic rockets, the V-2. This was the weapon of the future. The Germans did have a rocket artillery system, the 15-cm Nebelwerfer 41, a 6-barreled rocket mortar whose piercing scream earned it the nickname Moaning Mini among Allied troops. But it was a small-towed artillery piece. It reloaded slowly, had shorter range, and was a defensive weapon meant to break up infantry assaults. It had neither the range, nor the power, nor the mobility of the Katyusha. And mobility was the soul of the Katyusha. Flerev's battery demonstrated the tactic that would define rocket artillery for the next century: shoot and scoot. A Katyusha salvo, the launch of all 16 rockets, lasted less than 10 seconds. The crew could fire and begin moving to a new position before the last rocket even reached the target. This was crucial, because reloading was exhausting and dangerous. Each M13 rocket weighed over 42 kilograms, or 93 pounds. A crew of 6 to 7 men had to manually lift all 16 rockets onto the high rails. In early October 1941, during the Battle of Vyazma, one of the most catastrophic defeats of the Red Army, Flerev's battery was finally cornered. Trapped deep behind enemy lines with little fuel and ammunition, they were ambushed by a German armored column. Flerev issued his final order. True to their oath, the crews triggered the demolition charges. Captain Ivan Flerev and his entire secret battery died in combat, taking their weapons' secrets with them. They fired the first shots of a new kind of war and preserved its secret at the cost of their lives. For his sacrifice, Flerev was awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation, but only in 1995. For more than 50 years, his story and that of his battery remained classified. But the secret was already out. By the time Flerev's battery met its end, Stalin had ordered the production of thousands of Katyushas. A weapon that had begun as a secret experiment was to become a symbol of Soviet industrial might. The winter of 1941 to 1942 became a great turning point. The Wehrmacht was halted, frozen and bloodied, at the gates of Moscow. And far to the east, beyond the Urals, the evacuated Soviet factories began producing weapons on a scale the world had never seen. Factories such as Moscow's Kompressor and Voronezh's Komintern, dismantled and shipped east and reassembled in cities like Chelyabinsk, began churning out launchers. The BM-13 was crude, simple, and perfect for mass production. Many were welded by women and teenagers working in unheated workshops. Now, the trucks were whatever the Red Army could obtain. But the new superior chassis arrived by the thousands through the port of Murmansk, American Studebaker US-6 truck supplied under Lend-Lease. The Studer, as the Russians called it, was a revelation. Its six-wheel drive system and powerful engine gave the Katyusha mobility in Russian mud, Rasputitsa, and deep snow that the domestic ZIS-6 could only dream of. The true turning point for this new force was the hell of Stalingrad. In Stalingrad, the Katyusha's greatest weakness, its terrifying inaccuracy, became its greatest strength. Let's be clear, you did not use a Katyusha to hit a single tank. The rockets had no guidance. They were stabilized in flight by angled fins, but their trajectory was notoriously chaotic. One BM-13 firing 16 rockets covered an impact zone the size of a football field. It was an area denial weapon. In the ruins of Stalingrad, this was perfect. The Germans were entrenched in basements, rubble, and strongpoints. You didn't need a scalpel. You needed a hammer. A regiment-sized hammer, from 3 to 6 Katyusha units could fire a combined salvo of 576 rockets in less than 10 seconds. They didn't destroy a city block. They erased it. They turned the earth into liquid, shattered bunkers, and drove defenders insane. For the encircled German Sixth Army, strapped in the Stalingrad pocket, the Stalin organ was the sound of madness. A German veteran's account tells the story: "We were not afraid of artillery. We heard the boom of the shot and knew we had 20 or 30 seconds to find cover. But the organs, you heard the launch. You and the screen was already above you. There was no time. You just prayed." The psychological impact was profound. The 4.9 kilogram warhead of the M13 rocket was not as powerful as a 150 mm artillery shell, but it arrived together with 5 of its friends. The deafening, unending noise and concussion were weapons in themselves. It caused a state of paralyzing shock that German officers called Panzerangst, tank fear, except this was Raketenangst, rocket fear. German prisoners of war were often asked, "What weapon do you fear the most?" They didn't name the T-34 tank, which they respected. They didn't name the IL-2 Sturmovik, which they hated. The overwhelming majority answered that it was the thing they could not see, the thing that gave no warning. They called it the whistle of death. Stalingrad became the turning point. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 confirmed it. The Red Army went on the offensive permanently, and the Katyusha was its spearhead. By 1943, the Katyusha family had grown. The BM-8, a smaller 82 mm rocket mounted on light T-60 tanks for armored mobility, was used for direct infantry support. And then came 80, Andriusha, the male counterpart to Katyusha. This was the BM-31. A monster. A 310 mm rocket with a 60 kg warhead. These rockets were so large that they were fired from simple wooden or metal frames, often just set on the ground. They were crude, tumbled in flight, but were terrifyingly powerful. It was a bunker killer, designed to smash the concrete fortifications of the German Eastern Wall. Soviet doctrine was now called artillery preparation. No major attack began without hours, sometimes days, of artillery bombardment. And the Katyusha was the crescendo. The tactic was known as the fire symphony. First, the heavy guns and mortars fired, crushing defenses, chewing through barbed wire, and driving Germans into their bunkers. Then, just minutes before the infantry attack with the cry, "Hurrah!" the Katyushas began to play. It was pure psychological warfare. The Germans, huddled in their bunkers, already deafened by the guns, heard the rising unholy wail of a massive, coordinated salvo from hundreds of launchers. The entire horizon lit up. The earth boiled. The Germans were shredded, concussed, and driven to madness by this barrage. When the rockets finally stopped falling, the sudden ringing silence was no less terrifying. Survivors crawled out of their collapsed dugouts, deaf, with blood pouring from their ears and noses, completely disoriented, and straight into the bayonets and submachine guns of the advancing Soviet infantry. It was brutal and devilishly effective. The statistics of this new war of attrition are staggering. During Operation Bag Ration in the summer of 1944, the offensive that, in just 6 weeks, destroyed 28 German divisions and annihilated Army Group Center, the Red Army concentrated more than 200 artillery pieces per kilometer of front. A significant portion of these were Guards mortars, rocket artillery. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union had produced more than 12,000 Katyusha launchers of all types, and its factories had turned out more than 12 million rockets. The Germans desperately tried to copy it. By 1943 they had captured several intact launchers, but it was too late. Their own Nebelwerfer was never as mobile. Their attempt to copy the system, the Panzerwerfer, an armored half-track with a 10-barrel rocket launcher, was a typical example of German engineering, precise, high-tech, armored, and excellent. It was also too complex, too expensive, and they managed to build only a few hundred. The Germans were masters of high technology and refined engineering. The Katyusha was the opposite. It was crude, simple, cheap, and you could build 10,000 of them. In a war of attrition, Katyusha was the perfect weapon. The Wehrmacht, which had entered Russia in 1941 with arrogant contempt for the subhuman Red Army, was now retreating in panic. And at every step, from the banks of the Volga to the plains of Poland, they were haunted by the sound that became the anthem of their defeat. As one German soldier wrote in his final letter home, "When the organs begin to play, the earth boils, men are torn apart, the trenches fill with blood. This is no longer war. This is the end of the world." April 1945. The Battle of Berlin. The final act of the war in Europe. The Red Army encircled the Nazi capital. To break the last fanatical defenses on the Seelow Heights, fortified ridges guarding Berlin, Marshal Zhukov unleashed an artillery barrage of biblical scale. In the street fighting in Berlin, Katyusha crews performed their most dangerous and terrifying missions. They drove their Studebakers into shattered streets, lowered the rails for direct fire, and unleashed full salvos directly at fortified buildings and bunkers 2 to 3 kilometers away. A single launcher could level an entire city block, clearing the way for tanks. This was a fire symphony, like a final reconstruction of the city. When the guns finally fell silent over the ruins of the Reichstag, the Katyusha secured its place as one of the three great symbols of Soviet victory, alongside the T-34 tank and the PPSH-41 submachine gun. A Soviet soldier raised the red banner over the Reichstag. And in the foreground of that iconic photograph, parked in the ruins, stands a BM-13 launcher. Its rails point to the sky like a salute of victory. But the story of the Katyusha did not end in 1945. Its legacy was only beginning. The Soviet Union perfected the art of the multiple launch rocket system, MLRS. And it never forgot the lessons of Katyusha: power, mobility, and shock. In the 1960s, the direct descendant of the Katyusha was born, the BM-21 Grad. It was an improved Katyusha. Instead of 16 rockets on open rails, it carried 40 preloaded 122mm rockets in tubes. Instead of a 10-second salvo, it could fire all 40 in 20 seconds. It was more accurate, had greater range, and was mounted on a truck that could shoot and scoot even faster. The BM-21 Grad is, quite possibly, the most influential artillery weapon of the 20th century after its grandmother, the Katyusha. Tens of thousands were built. They were used in every major conflict since the 1960s, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, from Chechnya to the Middle East. Its characteristic coughing roar is the soundtrack of modern war. Today, in a quiet modern Russian museum, stands a restored BM-13 launcher. It looks small, almost primitive, a relic of a harsher era. Katyusha was not a precision weapon. It was a weapon of total war, a blunt, brutal instrument of fire and terror. It was inaccurate, slow to reload, and its rockets were filled with simple explosives. But it was also a weapon of psychology. It was the sound of Soviet fury, the music of vengeance, the fire of an angry god. It was the sound that signaled a turning point in the war. The sound that told the German soldier his war was lost. "I am an old man now," one German veteran recalled decades after the war. "I have seen everything. I fear nothing. But sometimes, when the wind whistles in a pipe, I hear it. I hear the organs, and I am back in the trench, and I am cold."